Previously, on parts 1 and 2 of our Cochise County special. Starting in the north end of the Dragoon Mountains southeast of Tucson, I followed a spur trail to the historic Dragoon Springs stage station. After spending the night in the gorgeous Cochise stronghold just to the east, I continued east past Pierce the following day, across the Sulphur Springs Valley and into the Chiricahua Mountains. There, I visited the grave of outlaw Johnny Ringo before continuing on mostly smooth roads to the ruins of Camp Rucker. With an extensive and tragic history as a military fort and later as a ranch, numerous buildings remain well preserved today. I ended the day with a 50-mile push back west into the Dragoons and into a secluded canyon near Middlemarch Pass, where I camped out at the ruins of the Middlemarch Mine. Today, on day 3 of my trip, I'll explore the Middlemarch Mine ruins and then continue south to the ghost towns of Courtland and Gleeson. While this area often gets overshadowed by its more popular neighbors of Bisbee and Tombstone, this rich copper mining district boasts a unique and vibrant history. With lots of stops and buildings in various states, it should be a busy day before making my way through Tombstone to my incredible camp on the other side of the Dragoons. After a solid night of restful sleep, it was a bit after sunrise when I got up. The night had been a bit chilly, but luckily not too cold or windy. With a hard deadline for my tour of Courtland at 11 o'clock, I couldn't procrastinate too much at camp this morning. Plus, I wanted to check out the area and some of the ruins before leaving. After getting changed, I made it outside of the tent. To save some time, I'd be eating breakfast on the trail, so I was able to clean up the kitchen stuff and pretty much everything else. I also took the opportunity to tighten down one of my lights that had worked itself loose over the course of yesterday. This was quick and meant I wouldn't have to stop to keep tightening it or worry about it falling off somewhere on the trail. I then worked on folding up and getting the tent packed up, which went smooth until I snagged a zipper and ended up spending entirely too much time working to get it unstuck. After eventually cutting it and prying it free, I now had most of camp cleaned up. The Middlemarch Mine appears to have been first discovered in 1895 and prospected by Chinese merchants from Tombstone and backed financially by businessmen in San Francisco. First called the Missouri Mine, the operation didn't take off until about 1899 or 1900 when Richard Gerd, who I'll talk about later, took over the property. A small water jacket furnace was operated until a small concentrating plant was soon built on site to process the ore. However, much of the low-grade ore found near the surface proved difficult to smelt and refine using the available methods. Due to the lack of success, about 70 additional carloads of ore were shipped to another smelter in Douglas, but mostly at a financial loss. In the early part of 1917, the property was taken over by the Arizona Middlemarch Copper Company. During this time, the mine was backed by Los Angeles businessmen who operated 43 claims at the Middlemarch, in addition to other nearby claims. A flotation mill was built on site with a daily capacity of processing 125 tons. This milling setup was more advanced than prior attempts and included a bucket elevator, ore bins, ball mill, and even tailing ponds. This allowed for better extraction of copper, silver, gold, and zinc, although ore values remained relatively low grade. At its peak, the Middlemarch employed about 20 men and had 12 buildings on site, including a large mill building, 300 horsepower steam plant, boiler house, and machine shop. The property had 9 shafts, 6 tunnels, and eventually up to 3.5 miles of underground tunnels. By 1919, 51 carloads of ore concentrate had been shipped, and by 1921, about 300 total cars had been shipped. At this time, the ore was hauled 9 miles back out to the railhead in Pierce, then south to the Copper Queen smelter for further refinement. The mill at Middlemarch shut down in September of 1920 due to water shortages, and the property sat idle from 1921 to 1924. Water played a vital role in the refinement of ore. The flotation mill was a water-intensive process as the tailing ponds would be filled up and slowly drained and dried out over a 2-week process. By 1942, the property was still idle. Assessment work and new owners completed mining on the property most notably in the 1950s and more successfully in the 1970s and 80s. During this time, the leaching ponds were revamped and expanded, plastic piping was added to the mine to clear it out of water, and an open pit area was further developed. Estimates claimed that 200,000 tons of ore was readily available underground, and the value of the ore was worth, quote, well over $6 billion, end quote. However, legal issues with the title and property owners slowed any chance of new development to a halt. It appears that after the 1980s, no further serious work was done, and the Middlemarch has been abandoned ever since. Walking around the mine today, many of the original foundational structures appear to remain. The multiple levels of the mill operation are the most notable. These were likely built sometime after 1917 when a new mill was constructed. Ore would have moved downhill, going through a variety of steps to refine it into a more transportable and valuable product. According to a grainy old newspaper photo, it seems like an impressive wooden framed structure was built over the milling area at one point. Further up the hill, I came across another clearing with a small concrete pad and an adit. The opening was well camouflaged in the terrain with some overgrowth and collapse in front of it. It was certainly a bit sketchy looking based on how it cut into the hill, but I decided to take a quick peek inside. A combination of wood timbering and corrugated metal made up the entrance, which seemed relatively stable. Further inside, some kind of wooden ladder or track, as well as some more modern plastic piping, lay on the floor. This was probably used to pump out water into the leaching operation in the 70s and 80s. The bottom was flooded with water at least a few inches deep. Not prepared to get soaked today, I headed back out. Back in the daylight, a few more structures lay further away from the adit. An earthen dam structure and a small pit, lined with cinder blocks and a concrete ramp, also remained. This was likely part of the later refining process, as it seems to be made of more modern materials. Back at the lowest levels of the mine, discolored rock remains in the old tailing ponds. It seems a considerable amount of material came out of this and other mines in the area. The tailing pile is topped with a solid slag, which is made up of metals and other impurities that weren't desired. Overall, the Middlemarch Mine was really neat, and I'm glad I returned for a night of camping and further exploring. Unlike my last visit here, which only lasted 5 minutes, this one was far better. Now close to 10 o'clock, I really needed to get moving. I left the Middlemarch Mine and headed back down the canyon to the main road. Luckily from here, all the way to Courtland was road I had just covered last night, so I knew it would be in good shape for the most part. I ate my breakfast as I worked my way south on the trail. High clearance is definitely a good idea, and 4-wheel drive might be helpful if things continue to erode. It didn't take long, and I soon arrived back at Middlemarch Road, which connects Tombstone and Pierce. The road is actually named for Army troops moving between Fort Huachuca and Fort Bowie. I stayed left to head east back downhill towards Pierce. It was a bit overcast today, but the views of the Sulphur Springs Valley were still nice. Aside from seeing a random pig, the drive was uneventful as I quickly covered the ground. I passed through Pierce and soon found myself on the fast-moving dirt roads heading towards Courtland. "9 miles from Pierce, I arrived at the turnoff for Courtland, which was marked with a few signs. I continued up the spur road and passed a few gates that would normally be closed to the general public. At the end of the road, I met my tour guide, Cindy, and parked at a large clearing at the former mine site. Cindy was filling in today for Mike, the current owner of Courtland, who was out of town. Mike has done some great development to the property, adding a nice outdoor lounge area that features artifacts, historic photos, and samples of the turquoise that he continues to mine today. There is also a living area, bathrooms, and even a shower. A variety of tours and events are hosted on the property. Today I'd be taking the history tour, which would feature an overview of Courtland and the mining that took place, as well as a few of the important structures left behind today. And aside from me, there was only one other couple on the tour today. We drove our own vehicles as we followed Cindy back out to the main road. We'd be cruising along Pierce Road and stopping and walking around at a variety of stops as part of the tour. Our first stop was along the old Main Street, home to most of the buildings during the height of Courtland's success. The immediate area was first worked by Native Americans, including the Hohokam, who found the turquoise in the upper reaches of the hills to be valuable. By 1890, with the boom of nearby towns of Tombstone and Bisbee, the area around Courtland attracted prospective miners. Some claims were established and the area was called Leadville, or North Turquoise at first. In 1899, claims were purchased by the Young brothers from Iowa, who, the next year, formed the Great Western Copper Company. The Great Western operated a couple of mines and sold $1 million in stocks, but progress was slow for the time being. By 1908, rich copper veins were discovered, and virtually overnight, the town exploded with growth. Leadville became a tent city, and eventually, the Great Western Copper Company dedicated a piece of land to develop a real town to be named after Courtland Young, one of the brothers who owned the company. Surveyors were brought in, and streets were cut into the desert floor. In February 1909, the newly found Courtland was open to investors to buy lots, and an alleged 100 people lined up the night before to get their pick. By March, a post office had been established, and around 2,000 people called the town home. With the mining success came two separate railroads, the Mexico and Colorado, owned by the El Paso and Southwestern, and the Arizona and Colorado, owned by the Southern Pacific. Reliable water for mining efforts and residents became an issue. However, the Courtland Water and Ice Company was soon established and ran 5 miles of water mains to supply the town, some of which is actually still visible in the middle of the dirt road today. At its height, Courtland had a movie theater, baseball field, coal-fired power plant, weekly newspaper, impressive jail, which I'll talk about later, a school, all kinds of stores, and even a car dealership. Courtland at one point was so successful that it was considered for the new Cochise County seat. However, it was never officially incorporated and lacked a city council or town hall, making it ineligible. Starting in 1917, the area was hit with a trio of crippling events. Most notably, the mines, which had been rich with copper thus far, began to hit a layer of limestone several hundred feet into the shafts. This spelled financial disaster and the onset of World War I, and the Spanish flu pandemic beginning in fall of 1918 hit the area and workforce hard. By 1921, the mass exodus out of the now played-out town had left Courtland nearly completely abandoned. While the mining had mostly fizzled out, the area remained a supply center for homesteaders in the area. In 1938, both railroads stopped train service to Courtland, and the tracks were pulled up. The jail was closed, and the post office shut down in 1942, bringing Courtland's relatively short but prosperous life to an end. While other mining efforts were made in the decades since, none so far have matched the initial success. Today, an image taken approximately over the Courtland Main Street shows just how little remains from the heyday. Most of the buildings were repurposed elsewhere or reclaimed by the desert in the years since. A few sidewalks and outlines of former buildings remain just off the present-day dirt road. Back on the tour, our next stop was just down the road at the old jail, one of the best preserved buildings today. At first, the town jail was an unused mining tunnel with a wooden door. However, after an inmate piled up his bedding and tried to burn his way out, only to be rescued by Sheriff John Bright the next morning, a proper jail was needed. A $1,000 contract to build a new structure was awarded, worth about $30,000 today, and construction began in April of 1909. By July, the new jail opened and featured 10-inch thick walls, 2 14 by 14 foot cells, each with their own toilet and sink area, as well as a front entryway. Much of the equipment for the Courtland jail came from the old jail in Bisbee. The fancy new jail quickly became a local attraction. Since the living conditions of the jail were nicer than the shacks and tents many of the miners lived in, it wasn't uncommon for them to commit petty crimes to spend the night in what affectionately became known as the Bright Hotel, named for deputy and constable at the time, Sheriff John Bright. In 1910, an identical copy of the building was used in the Gleeson jail just down the road. While the Courtland jail was largely unused after 1916, it remained open until 1938, and eventually its components were repurposed in the new Benson jail. Today, the jail remains in surprisingly good shape for being over 100 years old. The cement walls are largely intact, with several of the barred windows still present. Just down the road, a few more structures in not quite as good of shape remain. A large building, known as the Rock House, named not for its impressive masonry work, but rather the last name of the owner, sits crumbling today. The building was used as a sort of general store. The Rock House sits not far off one of the old rail lines, and several other structures and foundations remain visible further off the road. The hill, with several tailings visible, is where most of the mining success was found. An impressive leaching structure remains as well, where the ore would have been further refined before being sent off. It was in this area on our tour when we found a 1899 Liberty nickel laying on the ground. Across the road, another structure remains, allegedly used as a boarding house at one point. Today, the mix of rock work and cement walls remains in a suspended state of decay. It's amazing how just a few structures remain out of the hundreds that would have dominated this area during its heyday. The last stop on our history tour was the old Courtland Cemetery. Between 1909 and 1930, about 50 to 100 people from Courtland were buried in this quaint cemetery overlooking the Sulphur Springs Valley just outside of town. The cemetery features all kinds of residents who died from mining accidents, murders, or Spanish flu. Pneumonia was one of the leading causes of death in Courtland due to the dirty air from coal-fired trains, power plants, and life in the mines. One of the most notable residents was Simon Franklin. Born a slave, Franklin was a Buffalo soldier who served in the Civil War. After the war, he enlisted in the Army, where he became a sharpshooter and served in the cavalry until his retirement in 1892. He moved to Courtland to ranch and homestead and became known as Uncle Simon to many of the town's residents. His funeral was the largest in Courtland's history, with a military escort and gun salute at the service. The cemetery was neglected and vandalized as it fell into disrepair after Courtland was abandoned. Recent work and maintenance helped clear vegetation in the area and redo some of the old headstones. Today, the cemetery remains a quiet place to reflect on the life and the people that once occupied Courtland. As the tour wrapped up, we returned back to the main building. Courtland remains as well preserved as is possible today. The current owner is working on acquiring National Historic status for the town site. Modern-day mining companies are still actively pursuing copper in the area. However, hopefully the historic status can be preserved for future generations. And what has already been done is an excellent start. If you're in the area, a stop and tour of Courtland is absolutely worth the time and effort. Cindy ended up guiding us on a nearly 2-hour tour, sharing knowledge of the area and some of the fascinating stories from Courtland's past. It was after 1:30 when I left Courtland proper. I spent some time checking out a few more things before leaving the area. Some old railroad beds and a few other foundations dotted the area. Most of the buildings and foundations sit near the public road, but much of the mining activity does sit on private property, so use caution when exploring. I made my way back south, past the jail and to the Rock House. I decided this would be a nice spot to grab some lunch. I dipped back into the MRE mystery bag and had a quick bite inside the old structure. While I was finishing up lunch, I couldn't help but notice some low-flying aircraft, which turned out to be one of my all-time favorites, the A-10. Based out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, this area above Courtland is often used for training missions. After watching the A-10s for quite some time, I was eventually back on the road south. I continued right onto Ghost Town Trail, past more mine tailings that dotted the hill to the west. The drive was quick and easy and soon dumped me onto a paved road. I continued west towards my next stop in Gleeson. The road twisted and turned and soon entered the old town. While considered a ghost town by most, several residents do still live in the area. I pulled off at the old jail, an identical copy of the Courtland jail, which has since been restored and preserved. Built in 1910, a year after Courtland's, the jail today looks much like what the Courtland jail would have looked like. Today, the owner, Joe Bono, has turned it into a museum and offers tours on select days. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to hit it at the right time, and the large number of no trespassing and private property signs was a little discouraging. Several old buildings can be seen from the public road, and back towards the hill, several mining structures remain, including a headframe, tailings, and other workings, all of which are on private land today. Much like Courtland, Gleeson was first prospected by early Native Americans who pursued turquoise. By the 1870s, white prospectors had discovered copper, lead, and silver in the area. At first, the area was called Turquoise. A post office was open from 1890 to 1894. In 1896, an Irishman named John Gleeson staked a copper claim in the area. The mine had decent success, but a lack of water slowed production. In 1900, a new post office was opened and named Gleeson. In combination with the Courtland boom, Gleeson boomed as well. Almost one and the same, the two separate towns were connected, with many residents of Courtland traveling to Gleeson for services not offered in their town. Gleeson featured an actual hospital, bank, Chinese restaurant, and other buildings. In 1912, a catastrophic fire ripped through town, burning 28 buildings and claiming $100,000 in damage. While some of the town was rebuilt, and the town continued to produce copper through World War I, the mines played out in the 1930s. In 1938, Gleeson was the filming location for Paramount Pictures' production of a Zane Grey novel called Mark of the Avenger. However, the post office was closed just a year later in 1939. Down the road is the Gleeson Cemetery, which contains some old graves from throughout the town's history, and is still currently used by residents today. Other than this, there wasn't much to see from the public road. At this point, it was around 4 o'clock, and I figured I should continue rolling to my campsite for the night. I headed west along the paved road as it twisted and turned through more rolling grasslands. Some overcast clouds on the horizon made for some great views. After 15 or so miles, the road eventually dropped into Tombstone. I'd be spending tomorrow night here, so I continued straight through. A few miles outside of town, I turned off onto Middlemarch Road, which I would take most of the way to my campsite. I had been on the other end of this road earlier this morning, but tonight I plan to camp in the scenic western edge of the Dragoons. The first few miles featured a wide, heavily washboarded road. 12 miles from the paved highway, I turned off the main road and headed north toward the rugged Dragoon Mountains, which were now in full view just ahead. The road was slightly narrower, but still easy. There were a lot of people already camped out and a bunch of traffic on the road. It became clear that this was a very popular area, and it was easy to see why. The view got progressively better the further I traveled along the road. With the sun bouncing in and out of the clouds, I eventually came across a spur road and luckily found no one occupying the spot at the end of it. This wasn't the precise spot I had planned, but it was a nice open area that featured some incredible views and had a nice rocky hill nearby, so this would certainly work just fine. After the Jeep was leveled, I got camp set up. The light was starting to fade fast, so I tried to hurry it up so I could enjoy the last few minutes of light on the surrounding mountains. I got the essentials taken care of, tent opened, kitchen out, and some gear unloaded. I headed up a small hill just behind my camp. It wasn't very high, but it ended up providing the perfect vantage point to catch the last few minutes of daylight. This area was truly stunning, with rocky outcrops and spires surrounding me on all sides. While technically the westernmost edge of Cochise stronghold, this area shows why it was favored by the Chiricahua Apache, who used it as a natural fortress. Just up the road from here is Council Rocks, an area known for its collection of pictographs. First inscribed by the Mogollon people some 1,000 years ago, this area has long been attracting, fascinating, and holding importance to those traveling by. There's a lot of history here mixed in with the epic views, and I was happy to be here to witness even a small glimpse of it. All right, made it to night 3, and this is probably the best campsite of the trip, and I'd say maybe top 5, or it's up there. Just having this panoramic view of the Dragoons was incredible. But today's been a great day. Started hard to believe it started back at the Middlemarch Mine this morning, but we've made it through
and around the Dragoons, checking out a couple ghost towns along the way. And then we have this. Anytime you can match the can art with an actual like real life location like this, it's gonna be pretty cool. So gonna enjoy this, drinking this beer for a bit, and then get on to dinner. That's good. That's better.
Now that it was completely dark, it was time to get to work on food. Tonight's dinner would be the best of the trip, and one of my favorite meals to make. I fired up the stove and preheated the cast iron. After it was sizzling hot, I tossed in the ribeye, seasoned it up, and let it cook. Meanwhile, I got some water boiling for some instant mashed potatoes, which I know sounds sketchy, but they are surprisingly fantastic, at least while out camping. It didn't take too long, and dinner was soon finished cooking and paired up with one of my favorite beers. I sat down to enjoy, and it was delicious. By this point, the nearly full moon had risen and was gently illuminating the surrounding terrain. It was a bit chilly, and since it was my last night of camping, decided to make the most of it by having a fire. After a little encouragement, I soon got it going and sat down to enjoy a little more whiskey. It was nice to relax and warm up after another busy day through Cochise County. The fire lasted for quite a while and finally died down around 10 p.m. I grabbed a little dessert and retreated up into the tent for a little more reading and to wind down from the day. It didn't take too long, and eventually I was in the sleeping bag and drifting off to sleep. Tune in next time as I wrap up the final day and a half of my Cochise County special. I'll head west out of the Dragoons, back through Tombstone to the scenic San Pedro River Valley. I'll spend most of the day on foot, hiking to what is considered to be the bloodiest cabin in Arizona history, as well as to the ruins of Millville and Charleston, the now deserted towns that once supported the massive silver boom just down the road in Tombstone. Later, I'll head into Tombstone for the night, staying at a historic hotel and enjoying downtown, before wrapping up the trip at Fairbank Ghost Town, another impressive and well-preserved town along the San Pedro.